Okay, so the first question was about negative involvement versus positive, with divestment, for example, being seen as negative, and investing. And this is the Zionist lobby invented this: invest, don't divest. And then some conservative elements in the churches grabbed it and said, yes, we want to do something positive, whether knowing or not that they're repeating Israeli propaganda, basically. So what's the deal about this invest, don't divest? As Palestinian businesses would tell you, do both. Divest and invest. Why is it mutually exclusive? In other words, if you're involved in crime, and let's say you're supporting a rapist who's become known as a rapist, but you establish a shelter for rape victims, and you say, I don't want to do anything against the rapist because that's negative. I want to build a shelter for rape victims. Well, your goddamn money is helping the rapist continue. And your relationship is helping him to continue with his crimes. It's not just hypocritical, it's I don't have the word for it. So it's divest and invest is very important, because divesting, that level of boycott, is the most profound moral obligation. Martin Luther King Jr. said, boycott at a very basic level is withdrawing support for an evil policy or system. That's not heroic. Withdrawing support for a crime is not heroic. It's a basic moral obligation. You need to do that regardless whether you plan to invest or not. You've got to end your complicity in committing crimes. The Presbyterian Church, the Methodist Church, the Episcopalian Church, the Catholic Church are guilty of complicity in Israel's crimes through their pension fund investments. To end that guilt, they've got to divest. There's no question about that. That's a moral duty. They cannot hide behind, let's give the Palestinians some crumbs, and then we feel good about ourselves. No, you cannot feel good about yourselves, because your money is helping the oppression of the Palestinians to continue. It's perpetuating this unjust order. So divestment is a moral duty. Investment is a matter of choice. Now, and I won't stop there, because investment in occupied territories is never sustainable. You cannot sustain investments in an occupied situation without, in parallel, helping us to end the occupation. As the Europeans found out, the billions of dollars invested in the Palestinian economy were wiped out in a few months in 2002, when Israel's army invaded the West Bank and destroyed everything. Destroyed telephone booths, destroyed sidewalks, you name it, schools, factories, farms, complete destruction of the Palestinian economy. Very intentional, very systematic destruction. The billions of European money went out of the window. So it's not sustainable. It's important to support the Palestinians to have a steadfast economy, which is an extremely important form of resistance, because Israel wants us out. Israel does not want to exploit us as cheap labor. They want us out. They want to displace us, make the land free of Arabs. So helping us to steadfast is part of resistance. So if your investment is going in that direction to help us steadfast, that's important. But again, always in parallel with helping us end the occupation, and first and foremost, stopping your involvement in the occupation. That's the most important aspect of that. The second question about Jewish states discrimination connected with, your question was about Jewish state is connected, the concept of a Jewish state is connected to discrimination. By definition, having a Jewish state in Palestine means discrimination against the non-Jews. And in fact, Israel has more than 50 laws that discriminate against its own non-Jewish citizens, the indigenous Palestinians. So it's a very deeply racist, founded on racism. So racism is not a policy in Israel, it's in the very foundation of the state. The Zionist ideology is a racist ideology, and that's how Israel was built, was designed to be racist against the indigenous. So does the BDS movement suggest a particular way out of this, as in one democratic state, for example, where there's no racism, no discrimination against anyone based on identity. As I said earlier, as a coalition, a huge coalition, we do not take any political position, one state versus two states. Personally, with my other hat, for more than 30 years, I've advocated a secular democratic state, and I'm not ashamed of it. That's my position. A unitary secular democratic state where there's no discrimination, one person, one vote, respect for everyone's culture, everyone's language, but no discrimination whatsoever, with the right of return for refugees, because that's the point. But in the movement, we do not take a position because we are based on the lowest common denominator and the occupation of 67 and the racial discrimination, the system of apartheid in Israel, and allow the refugees to return. Those are the 3 points of unity this whole huge coalition agrees on. We don't step out of that lowest common denominator, except individually in other movements. But in the BDS movement, we don't do that. The third question was about Zionism and the identity politics. And when somebody raises that, they are attacked. Why do we attack? We can just use a different tactic, but why do we attack anyone? Without mentioning names, I don't want to engage in attacking any particular person at this moment, but it goes well beyond just raising the specter of identity politics. Zionism is clearly identified in BDS literature as a racist ideology. In our strategy paper of 2008, explaining the regime of occupation, settler colonialism, and apartheid, Zionism is at the core of that entire analysis. So we don't need any, any white European to lecture us about Zionism and the ills of Zionism. But in that particular case that you mentioned, it wasn't simply a patronizing colonial lecture to the indigenous what we should consider as a danger to us. It was an anti-Semitic moment. It was essentializing Jews as essentially being Zionist in a way, essentially having a problem as Jews. So you either abandon Judaism as it became through thousands of years in an organized way, or you cannot be progressive. And we reject that. We reject any attempt to essentialize Jews. Whether it's a far left or a far right attempt to essentialize Jews, it's the same to us. We reject that out of hand. We cannot accept that kind of ideology, and we cannot accept in our ranks anyone, Jewish or not, who claims that all Jews are one and the same or must abandon this or that in order to be accepted. We can't accept this kind of ideology. The last question was two parts. The EU trade with Israel being the most important trade partner of Israel. What's happening with that? You're not following the news. I'll tell you a lot of good news about that. And the academic boycott being controversial and divisive. And the academic freedom issue that's always brought up. How do we address that? For the EU, yes, the EU is Israel's largest trade partner as a group. So it's extremely important to make any changes in the EU. But a lot has changed in the last few months. In the summer of last year, the EU passed guidelines that basically ended any financial support to Israeli entities active in the occupied territories. Now, it might sound very mild, and it is quite mild. I mean, it's not revolutionary. But given the level of European complicity in Israel's regime of oppression, it is revolutionary, in a way. Part of that, a very important clause in those European guidelines that were passed last year, was ignored by the media, although that's extremely important, and I'll explain why it became now recognized as extremely important. Those guidelines, EU guidelines, said that the European Bank will not give any loans or have any financial transactions with any Israeli bank that has any operations in the occupied territories. All Israeli banks have operations in the occupied territories, which means the EU said that the European Bank will basically boycott all Israeli banks. What's important about that is adopting the BDS philosophy. Because in the BDS movement we say that it's the state of Israel that's responsible for the occupation. Even if you don't care about the ethnic cleansing, about 48, about the refugees, if you're just entirely focused on the 1967 occupation, it's the state of Israel that's responsible for the occupation. So you've got to hold Israel accountable for its occupation and building settlements. The EU is adopting that logic on a much more micro scale against the banks, which is a trial phase. I mean, if it passes against the banks, the logic, we can extrapolate that and say, well, what about Israel? By the same token, Israel is responsible for the occupation, because the EU did not decide to boycott Israeli operations in the occupied territories. They decided to hold the entire bank responsible for having operations in the occupied territories. The difference is huge, enormous for the BDS movement. As a result, so some Israelis said, some in the Israeli establishment said, oh, it's symbolic. Yeah, the Europeans will never dare because of the Holocaust and the guilt factor and US power in Europe, which is enormous. I mean, Europeans are not very independent politically when it comes to the Middle East. They take their marching orders from Washington, largely. Regardless, a few days ago, actually 2 days ago, PGGM, the largest Dutch pension fund manager, which has assets of 200 billion, with a B, $200 billion, divested completely from all Israeli banks because of their involvement in the occupied territories. Now, this is unprecedented on many levels. I mean, we were shocked by the news. We were so positively shocked by the news because those are not Irish banks. Those are not Spanish or Scandinavian. Those are Dutch. The Netherlands is Israel's best friend in Europe, or second best friend in Europe, systematically defending Israel in the Human Rights Council and the United Nations. The Netherlands has a horrific record of complicity in supporting, whitewashing Israeli crimes. So for a huge Dutch pension fund to take this measure, it's a snowball that will grow very fast. If the Netherlands can get away with this, wait for the Irish and the Danish and the Swedish, and it will develop much faster. So there's a lot happening in Europe, and I can go on and on. There are several companies, even in Germany, that have boycotted Israeli projects because of being involved in the occupied territories. In fact, Deutsche Bahn, the largest train company in Germany, which is state-controlled, which is very important. It doesn't do anything without the state, the government in Germany, agreeing to it, withdrew a couple of years ago after a lot of work, including Pax Christi, a Christian NGO working for human rights, decided to withdraw from an Israeli train project connecting Tel Aviv with Jerusalem, simply because the plan, the route of that train, the railroad, passed through Betiksa and other villages in the occupied Palestinian territory of 1967. Just that fact helped campaigners in Germany to say this is illegal, violates international law, Deutsche Bahn cannot participate, and Deutsche Bahn did withdraw. And I think that was the first time in German-Israeli history, since 1948, that a German company withdraws from an Israeli project over violations of international law. Never happened. Germany especially, never ever happened. A lot is changing in Europe, and Israel is recognizing that. Tzipi Livni, I quoted her before, she said that Israel's economy feels very strong, but we're living in a bubble. The glass ceiling of the Israeli economy is the Palestinian conflict. Unless we reach some settlement with the Palestinians, this boycott movement will destroy us. So they're feeling the heat from Europe much more than 2 years ago even. It's happening.